For those of you who don't know, I have a group on DeviantArt called Dreadful Tales, the Journal of Lurid Adventure, which I edit with Edie Phoenix. And the whole point of the group is to produce every 2 months a sort of magazine, with the issues of which are composed of stories submitted by other people on DeviantArt and myself, and have illustrations and advertisements, cover page, all the stuff that a genuine pulp magazine might have had from their heyday between, say, the 1840s and about 1939. Sort of hoping to show you what, in general, we are aiming to recreate when we do these issues. There's a broad range of pulp topics that wind up getting covered in the stories and the illustrations. There are many different genres. The whole point of the group and the magazine is to recapture the flavor of the way that aesthetic in fiction actually was during that period in history, and sort of bring back the fun parts and to some extent leave out some of the more unfortunate parts. To give you an idea what I'm talking about here, I'm first going to show you a vintage pulp magazine that I have. I think might be the only one in my possession. This is an original printing. This is a little bit later from the kind of stuff that I generally aim at emulating. Let's see, it's got marked up there. This is a 1947 of Fantastic Adventures. You can get an idea of the proportions. For reference here, I'm just going to show you a trade paperback. This is one of the common oversized trade paperbacks we see today. They are almost the same size. Trade paperbacks are obviously thicker. Pulps, get their name from having what's considered lower grade paper. You can see the way it yellows, usually thin, usually grayish when it was originally made. And you can see here, it's a magazine format thing, filled entirely with genre stories in 2 columns here, usually illustrated, and the artwork, being either really racy or really provocative in some form or another. We got the wizard guy on the cover here, shooting a gun at, the hero guy shooting a gun at a wizard who's probably indestructible for some magic reason. The Lamp of Vengeance. We got Eastern mysticism there. It's a really big thing. You got advertisements on the back. It's the late 40s, so the UFO phenomenon is taking off. Post Roswell and all that. And you can see this thing is beat up. It is old. Probably could have been cared for a little bit better, but it's been through so many hands, including mine. I usually keep it in plastic, but just for the purpose of display here, get an idea of what that's all about. Most of what I have for the pulp genre are reprints. They reprint a lot of this stuff nowadays. This approximates what I think a 1937 issue of Detective Short Stories would have been, but this is printed this century. You can see it's got the modern stuff like on the back. It's got a description of the UPC symbol rather than the ads. However, this is taken from all the original stuff that went into this issue, so it does represent the advertising of the period. I don't know if you've ever seen like older comic books from stuff like I think as late as the 90s, but in the 80s and before especially, you'd get whole pages of these small like block type ads, saying that for 65 cents you could get something like 10,000 Army Men or stuff like that, X-ray specs. And a lot of the advertising, even aimed at adults, usually the level isn't much higher than that. But you can see here the same thing's present. We get a table of contents at the beginning here. We got a series of stories with great titles like Murder by Inheritance, Murder Clocked In, Slayer's Field Day, because this is a crime pulp. So the element of fantasy is less present in it because, by the 30s they were trying to do that hard-boiled thing, late 30s here. So this is like Dashiell Hammett era, although his stuff appeared in Black Mask. But that gives you a feel for it, and you can see the headers there. The type of font that was used. Death holds the aces, I actually read this one. I haven't read everything I've collected yet, just because I collect so furiously. There are 1 or 2 winners in there, and there's a lot of junk, but that's sort of the nature of it. This is the storytelling that's was generally and sometimes still is considered to be of the lower caliber. The storytelling that represented in Dreadful Tales doesn't only cover the 20th century. The 19th century is represented as well. This is a reprint of a British penny dreadful. That's what they used to call them, penny parts. Of these long serials that would come out, a little bit at a time, serialized for a penny each, And this is Black Bess or the Knight of the Road, which represents famous British 18th century outlaw Dick Turpin, among others. This is actually, you can see it's actually huge. It's really heavy to hold up. But this is the longest Penny Dreadful ever put out. It's over 2 million words. And you're going to see why here. Even if the book doesn't look that big, you can see it's got font about the size of the fine print on your credit card bill, like possibly a prayer book. It's in 2 columns just the same, because this, nobody ever bothered to take the words and reprint them in another form. So this is from the original pages as they appeared in the mid-19th century. And there's a lot of it. And actually there are... Yeah, some of the illustrations appear here. So you can see, even though it's not the highest quality stuff, you can see there's some nice hatching work. I'm told that with the Penny Dreadfuls, they were like soap operas, so they'd have to ensnare an audience early on to, keep buying an ongoing serial, and a lot of them would have higher quality art at the outset, and it would sort of decline as it went on. This is a printing from Dover. From the 1970s, when a lot of cool old stuff was getting reprinted, and this represents 8 different American dime novels. And dime novels are sort of what the Americans had, while the British were having the Penny Dreadfuls. The difference being that it's a complete story that comes out in each one, presumably for a dime. Sometimes there's also nickel papers. These started up about the 1860s, although a lot of the ones in this book are from around 1900. Let's see here. There's a really good, if you ever get your hands on this book, there's a great introduction by E.F. Blewer where he sort of explains the phenomenon. So this would have been the front page for the Old and Young King Brady story, where they take on the girl smuggler that chase all over New York and Canada. There's this pair of, I think they're meant to be French-Canadian smugglers, and their daughter is in on it too, and I guess that was supposed to be somewhat alluring, even though the story it is done in a very light, very juvenile. It's very innocent of anything overt like sexuality, although that wasn't the case of all the dime novels. A lot of them were aimed at younger readers, though. Frank James on Trail. For both the Penny Dreadfuls and the dime novels, it was a really big deal to make accounts, true or otherwise, of famous outlaws like the James Gang, or other famous personages. The Wild West was current during a lot of these, so you get people like Buffalo Bill. There's a Nick Carter one in here. Nick Carter was really a sensation in his day. Preempts a lot of the James Bond stuff and all that. A lot of the tropes that we've come to love from movies in the 60s, 50s and 60s, have their roots in the pulp fiction of the 1930s and before. Some of these are from, you can see there's 3 columns on this one, and it's printed even smaller. These are Beatle Dime Library reprints, and the Beatles saved a lot of money on paper. Frank Merriwell's Nobility. For me, this was the worst story in the lot, just because Frank Merriwell is just such a complete and awful prude. He is, I don't know if you'd call him a hypocrite, but he's just a jerk. It takes place mostly on an ocean liner, and he and his friends are hanging out, being clean living lads, and a British guy comes to their door asking for help because he's seasick and he's hungover a little bit. And rather than offer him any sort of an aid, even though, the guy's got an awful headache and his stomach's upset and they're on a boat, there's nowhere really to go, they basically just shun him to his face and judge him. It's like, how dare you be such an indulgent foreigner? Why can't you be a clean living American like us? It's, That's the sort of thing I would rather not emulate. If I did, it would be parody, and, the heroes would be villains, essentially. This actually closes on Adrift in New York by none other than Horatio Alger Jr. Most people these days, 100 years later, will only have heard of Horatio Alger in a history class, if they heard of him at all. His name is basically synonymous with really naive, idealized fiction. He usually has tramp characters who, people who are impoverished, usually boys, who do something to distinguish themselves, morally, they save somebody or they do some self-sacrificing good deed, and they're rewarded with fame and fortune, basically, and everything turns around for them on a dime. This is a reprint, an older reprint. This is from Odyssey Publications. I've actually found 3 of these now, but this one is Magic Carpet. I don't know how much larger the original was. Some of the older Street and Smiths from about the turn of the 19th to 20th centuries were about this size. But I got this because people like Robert E. Howard got printed in these. And you can see with the theme, Magic Carpet and all that, it's all very much about exoticism and Eastern mysticism, which is a big running theme throughout most of older pulp, that stuff that didn't go for, like, the stuff that wasn't just straight crime or stark realism, although some of that even would indulge in this sort of thing. It was all very imaginative, very much not based in reality. You see Seabury Quinn, Vagabond at Arms. You got a pretty good illustration reproduced there. I'm not sure how much they approximated the original font with these, but you can see they got the two-column thing going on. And I haven't been through any of these yet, but I know I like some of the authors. This one has Clark Ashton Smith, one of the Lovecraft Circle, along with Robert E. Howard. So very significant stuff. Clark Ashton Smith does still get reprinted today. In fact, they've got his collected works in Barnes & Noble, of all places, even though they don't usually sell books anymore. And you can just see throughout here, basically, get you an idea. And I don't think they reproduced any of the original ads in these. They weren't up to that task, but they did get you the stories and the illustrations. So that's most of the way there, and you can see this more typewriter font here. These are more or less fanzines the way they're done, but I just think it's really cool that the interest in these things just keeps sparking up again, like every, couple of decades. I'm going to give you a more iconic example of a character who crops up pretty often. The Shadow, action-packed thrillers by Maxwell Grant, actually Walter B. Gibson, magician and journalist who typed until his fingers bled, basically. The guy put out over 1 million words a year, as some of these more prolific fellows did. And these are done in twofers, right? So there would only be one, in the original 1930s printings of these. These started appearing in 31. This one has The Triple Trail and Murder Genius. And this still very much, even though there's a lot of supplemental material, it's almost like like a collector's edition DVD in that sense, or Blu-ray or what have you. But it preserves much of the original format. You get frequent chapter breaks. You get cool illustrations like that. I think that's pretty key. And there's, one of the many interpretations of the Shadow there. A lot of illustrators took him on. Many films. The Shadow actually came from radio because Street and Smith had a radio drama just to showcase various versions of crime stories that were in their magazines at that time in the 20s and 30s. And they'd actually stopped using the character on radio, but wanted to secure their copyright. So they had Walter B. Gibson crank out a first novel, having a mysterious detective who could be invisible, and was a mystery even to his many agents who carried out a lot of his stuff for it. As the series goes on, the Shadow himself appears more often in the iconic costume, very sort of a superhero on his various identities. I could go on and on, but you can look it up. It's cool. I'm going to show you 3 Penny Dreadfuls here just to close it out that I got. These are all from original plates. Wild Boys of London and or Children of the Night. There was a big backlash against this sort of fiction because it was considered to be low quality and for the lowest common denominator, so people tried to get it banned. This series actually did end in its second run because it was basically halted by the police for whatever reason. Yeah, you can see adventure in the tropics there with somebody's interpretation of what that might be like. The font is not always in the best of shape, not always the most readable, if you can see in these, because they're taken sometimes from original wood type or just photocopies of what survived of the entries. A lot of people collect these. I obviously haven't been fortunate enough to find a lot of the genuine article, but that can get really expensive. This is another one about Dick Turpin. There were many Penny Dreadfuls about Dick Turpin. He was like the Buffalo Bill of England. This one's printed a little bit differently, but it is original in that regard. You can see the illustrations. Dick Turpin, the highwayman, who is somehow just, over the course of the story. This is another one of the longest running Penny Dreadfuls. This is Varney the Vampire, which appeared in the 1840s, and actually many of the things we know as modern vampire tropes, or were modern vampire tropes before it got reinvented every 10 years, came from this and not actually from Bram Stoker's Dracula. This book is enormous. You can see the size of the font. It's very small. There's over 200 chapters of this, and this book, as huge as it is, and it is big, it's over 700 pages. So this stuff went on and on, much like a soap opera, and basically lasted as long as people would keep buying it. And if a character ever started to outlast his popularity, they'd do something to kill him off, and the publisher would include a note saying that join this magazine next week where the new character will appear, and they'd announce somebody else and he would catch on or he wouldn't. So that gives you a small idea. You know, you had basically all the genres under the sun. You know, it's before comic books there was this, before television there was this. You know, it was the means of entertainment for the masses, and the backlashes against it essentially had to emulate it anyway to create sales. The penny dreadfuls were countered by halfpenny dreadfulers, as some call them. And oftentimes they have very simple plots, you know, hero v villain, horse chases, trap doors, you know, poisons, you know, sword fights, gunfights, ray gun fights, science fiction. Very much grew up out of this sort of Edgar Rice Burroughs. People like H.G. Wells, their stuff was published serialized, much like this other stuff here. But it is a rich and extensive history. I find it quite exciting, and I've attempted, in many ways, to emulate that with Dreadful Tales, with my group for DeviantArt, and that's why I've created a couple of different characters to appear in serialized adventures, complete with the cliffhangers that these things would have. In pulp magazines of like the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, especially. Like, there would always just be, you know, the big escapes, and it would be kind of like a 40s film serial, where it would end and you wouldn't quite know what was going to happen next. If you're versed in stuff a little more recent, the 1960s Batman, and the Adam West one, anytime they had a 2-part episode, it would kind of run that way, like tune in next week, same bat time, same bat channel. You know, in the film series, you'd return to the theater the next week, and with the pulp magazines, you'd have to buy the next issue, and that kept the issues rolling out, and that's exactly the kind of thing we hope to do. And I hope some of you enjoy that kind of thing too. Next issue of Dreadful Tales, we have a deadline for submissions, both for stories, illustrations, and for ideas for a group mascot for the magazine character. It would represent it. The due date for that, the deadline, or dreadline as I call it, is March the 8th. If you can have that in by 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, March the 8th, you can make the issue. Well, that's all for now. Thank you.